From humble beginnings in rural Kansas, Dwight David Eisenhower rose to become the most powerful man on the planet. Before reaching that pinnacle, he took charge of the Allied defenses against the Nazi beast that was roaring across Europe. He led the world to victory, becoming the undisputed man of the hour before leading America through the fabulous 50s. In today's Biographics, we learn about the 34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower was born on the 14th of October 1890 in Denison, Texas. His parents had lived in Abilene, Kansas before his birth, and it was there that they returned when he was just an infant. As a child, he was involved in an accident that cost his younger brother an eye. He later referred to this as an experience that taught him the need to be protective of those who were under him. His childhood there, it was active, eager, and happy. Sports played an important part in his development, and he excelled in baseball, both in school and on a vacant lot next to his home. Eisenhower said that not making the baseball team at West Point was one of the greatest disappointments of my life, maybe my greatest. Yet football, it was his first love. He made the varsity football team and was a starter as running back and linebacker in 1912 when he tackled the legendary Jim Thorpe of the Carlisle Indians. Though sport was important, the greatest staple of the Eisenhower family was religious observance. The Bible was the guide to family life. While speaking of himself in 1948, Eisenhower said he was one of the most deeply religious men I know, though unattached to any sect or organization. The Eisenhower home was also a home of patriotism as well as faith, and one of respect for things of the mind. Competition and hard work were staples of the family routine. Young Eisenhower worked during his spare time at a creamery while he was at school. Dwight was 20 when he left Abilene. His destination was the military academy at West Point. He graduated in 1915 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant of infantry. He graduated in the middle of his class, which came to be known as the class that the stars fell on, because 59 members eventually became general officers. In the summer of 1916, as a newly promoted first lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, Dwight married Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver. She was his wife until Eisenhower's death in 1969. Events in Europe, they were forging a new way of life for the entire world. World War I gave many officers their first experience of combat, but young Eisenhower was not among them. It brought him, instead, command of a training center at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There, he prepared troops of a new tank corps for overseas deployment. His performance won him the Distinguished Service Medal. He was stationed to Europe, but before he could get there, the war had ended. In the late 1920s, after graduation from the Command School and General Staff School, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to France to prepare a guidebook on American battlefields in Europe. It was his first direct experience with that continent. In the 1930s, he served under many talented generals such as John J. Pershing and General Douglas MacArthur. In the Philippines, he worked for MacArthur for 4 years, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine Army, and he was helping the Commonwealth government work out a plan for its military defense. Eisenhower had strong philosophical disagreements with MacArthur regarding the leadership qualities that an American Army officer should develop in his subordinates. The resulting animosity between Eisenhower and MacArthur, it lasted for the rest of their lives. Ordered back to the United States in December of 1939, Eisenhower went to Fort Lewis, Washington, as an executive officer of the 15th Infantry Regiment. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe, it was streaking its destruction through European skies. France was being subjugated, and Britain was left standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. Late in 1940, Eisenhower was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Infantry Division. His staff work brought with it an assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Army Corps. In the summer of 1941, he became the Chief of Staff to Colonel Walter Kruger, whose newly organized 3rd Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers ever held by American troops. In these maneuvers over the Louisiana countryside, Eisenhower's task was to work out a plan of defense against an invading mass force. Soon the maneuvers were over, and Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General. Then, within a matter of days, came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Although his supervisory abilities had been noticed, before entry into World War II, he had never held an active command above a battalion and was far from being considered as a commander of major operations. From almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General D. Eisenhower would be inexorably bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. One of the plans formulated during this time was the central strategic determination to make an eventual attack across the English Channel. This was to be called the Principal Allied Defensive Effort. Eisenhower's ability to rise to grave responsibility brought him rapid promotion. Because an all-out Channel invasion would be impossible before 1944, and because the need for offensive action was immediate in 1942, the Allies undertook a combined operation under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that was the invasion of North Africa. The minimum objective of this maneuver was to seize the ports between Casablanca and Algiers along the rim of the North African coast. Troops were put ashore in late November, encountering resistance ranging from mild in Algiers to surprisingly stiff at Casablanca. The commander's hope was to push quickly along the east of the Mediterranean and take possession of the important posts of Béziers and Tunis. But a number of unfavorable circumstances, including treacherous weather conditions, prompted the commander to hold off on his vital assault. In the spring, however, troops of Omar Bradley's 2nd Corps were able to take Béziers, and at the same time Tunis fell to the British First Army. With these victories, well, that was the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. The Allied leaders and the men who had fought under them proudly commemorated their victory. One of the greatest products of the victory, in the words of Eisenhower himself, was the progress achieved in the welding of Allied unity and the establishment of a combat team that was already showing the effects of a growing confidence amongst all its members. The end of this campaign, it brought personal recognition to Eisenhower throughout the world as him being a great leader. The commander himself interpreted this recognition as proof that free men can find unity in victory, even against seemingly invincible odds. The next big campaign, the invasion of Sicily, brought further demonstration of this basic truth. Allied troops took this vital rock in the summer of 1943. The effects of Sicily's fall, they were electric. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis powers to capitulate. Now the Allies prepared for what was to be the most fiercely fought battle of the Mediterranean War, the invasion of Italy itself at Salerno. Through a miracle of courage and tenacity, Lieutenant General Mark Clark's army established a beachhead, overwhelming German odds and taking Salerno and the vital port of Naples. With these victories, although heavy fighting and important battles did lay ahead, the first major objectives of the Italy campaign were accomplished. Allied forces were on European soil, and they were able to pin down German troops far from the scene of the cross-Channel invasion, which was planned for the following year. President Roosevelt visited the combat area with General Eisenhower when he came over for the Cairo and Tehran conferences. Their agreement was once again established that the principal Allied effort would be the invasion of Europe. Shortly afterwards, the man who would oversee this awesome undertaking was named, and yes, of course, it was to be General Dwight David Eisenhower. People throughout the free world were now calling him the man of the hour. The Supreme Commander's orders from the General Staff, they were quite simple. Land on the coast of France and thereafter destroy the German ground forces. Yet between the order and its execution, well, there was certainly going to be a lot of effort. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could simply push back any invading army. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for this invasion was a job without let-up. Incessant and realistic training, it was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all of these were simply overwhelming. But through these tense months, in the early part of 1944, the operations, they continued. Finally, after being postponed for one day because of weather conditions, the eve of the day of decision was at hand. The commander visited the airborne troops who would lead the invasion. He later wrote, "I found the men in fine fettle, joshing and assuring me that I had no cause for worry." Yet, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance, Eisenhower felt the weight of the world. Moving the largest invasion force in the history of mankind across the English Channel was a huge logistical challenge. But the success of the enterprise, it was largely dependent on something outside of Eisenhower's control, and that was the weather. With the arrival of June, there were just 4 days of potential good weather that Eisenhower could work with. The invasion, it was planned for June the 5th, but then bad weather rolled in on the 4th with the expectation of more to come. Eisenhower therefore considered postponing the invasion. On the other side of the channel, the Germans, they were confident that there would be no invasion attempt during the inclement weather. And it was at this point that the Supreme Allied Commander had a decision to make. And finally, he told his generals, "I don't like it, but we have to go." On June the 5th, at 9:45 p.m., he gave the order for the landings to begin the following morning on June the 6th. He said, "Okay, let's go." He then addressed the airmen, the sailors, the troops of his command, stating, "You are about to embark on the Great Crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine and the elimination of Nazi tyranny. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained and well-equipped and battle-hardened. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking." In the wallet of the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, however, was secreted the following note, dated June the 5th. "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and navy, did all that the bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Those last two words, "mine alone," they were underlined by Eisenhower. At 3 a.m. on June the 6th, President Roosevelt was telephoned with the information that Operation Overlord was underway. Just 2 days later, Eisenhower was able to report to his president that the operation was a success. Throughout D-Day, June the 6th, 156,115 men landed on the beaches of Normandy. By the end of June, in excess of 850,000 men, along with 570,000 tons of supplies and 148,000 vehicles, they were on French soil. The unstoppable march to Berlin was underway. The Nazi surrender came on May 7, 1945. The Japanese followed just 4 months later, but only after the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on their people. Eisenhower was opposed to the dropping of the bombs. After they were unleashed, he said, "First, the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Second, I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon." For Dwight Eisenhower, the return from war was met with the cheers of people from all over the world. In his own homeland, a hero's welcome awaited him. Despite his desire to enter retirement, America, they had other tasks waiting for their favorite soldier. He succeeded General Marshall as the Army's first post-war chief of staff. He expressed belief that one of the greatest pillars of world peace was a strong United States, and visited troops stationed in various parts of the world and encouraged America's growing sense of global responsibility, saying, "We must remain the first champions of those who seek peace in their own lives and peace with their neighbors." Finally, on February 7, 1948, the general from Abilene, after 36 years of service to his country, left active military assignment. He did not, however, leave active participation in the life of his nation. He accepted an invitation from Columbia University to serve as president of that institution. At the time, he thought that this would enable him to devote the remainder of his time on Earth to the challenges of education. But events of the post-war world, they dictated otherwise. The urgent need for unity in the free world brought into being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It soon became clear that there was only one man who could make that vital and complicated organization work, and that was Eisenhower. At the end of 1950, he answered his country's call once more, and he again was on European soil to take supreme command of the land, the sea, and the air forces of a grand defensive alliance. Against the new threat arising from the Soviets, who had previously been his nation's ally, he had to create, within the war-weary European soul, the will to defend itself so that freedom, so dearly bought, would not be lost. For more than a year, he labored diligently at his task of coalition. When he turned over the reins of command to General Matthew Ridgway, the structure of military unity among the free nations, upon which rested the hope for continued peace, it was well established. Once again, with the establishment of substantial victory behind him, this might well have been the end of Eisenhower's public career. Indeed, this was the end of Eisenhower the soldier, but it was just the beginning of Eisenhower the statesman. Although he had shown no interest in politics, Eisenhower was pursued as a presidential candidate by both the Republicans and the Democrats. Dissatisfied with the Democrats over their handling of the Korean War and charges of corruption within the White House, Eisenhower decided to join the Republicans and run for office. He felt that the country needed him. As he watched the country going in the wrong direction, he knew that he was the right man to get things back on track. Beyond his military reputation, Eisenhower was a very charismatic individual. "I like Ike" was more than just a campaign slogan, it was a true sentiment. He was seen as a decent man who was willing to put himself forward to do what was right for the country when what he truly deserved was to live out his final years in peace and seclusion. His overwhelming popularity catapulted him to the White House, and while most people liked and trusted Ike, they weren't always sure that he was engaged in Oval Office affairs. A lot of people felt that he was simply presiding over an administration and that others were really making the decisions. However, although he had a reputation for being out to lunch, every major policy decision really was his decision. It was really him who was calling the shots. In his first significant accomplishment, Eisenhower brought about an end to the Korean War, forging an armistice that is still in effect today. While his military career has been built on waging war, now it appeared that he was determined to use his presidency to pursue peace. He began downsizing the military. By spending less money on defense, he believed that America could spend more on infrastructure and quality of life. He went from orchestrating the largest military operation in history to pushing the world's largest public works project through Congress, the Federal Highway Act. While Americans welcomed the change to their landscape, they were not receptive to other changes to their culture. One of the great unresolved issues after World War II was whether or not African Americans would continue to be forced to live in a segregated society. In 1954, the Supreme Court banned racial segregation in public schools in its landmark ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. Although Eisenhower had appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, the motivating force behind the revolutionary ruling, Eisenhower publicly distanced himself from the decision, considering it to be a disruptive and inappropriate role for the federal government. In his eyes, the country was not yet ready for desegregation. Words that he shared with Warren in private, they confirmed this. Eisenhower asked him to consider the perspective of white parents in the Deep South. "These are not bad people," the president said. "All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big black bucks." In 1954, after the French were defeated in Vietnam and the country was split in two, Eisenhower pledged his support for the pro-Western government of South Vietnam over the communist-run North. He took a series of steps that were essential to America's growing involvement in Vietnam. The most important was the creation of the Bank of Vietnam, through which huge sums of money were sent to South Vietnam for aid and support. Under Ike's leadership, America enjoyed peace and great prosperity during his first term. With the economy soaring, he easily won re-election in 1956. An interesting note here is that during his presidency, Eisenhower was on the maiden flight of Air Force One, which replaced the previous presidential aircraft, the Columbine. Traditionally, second presidential terms are much tougher than the first, and this was certainly true for Eisenhower. First, he had health concerns, suffering a heart attack in 1955. That, combined with his aloof reactions to growing civil rights unrest, made him seem rather weak. Then came Sputnik, the first satellite in space, launched by the Soviets in 1957. Americans, they became hysterical, believing that there was a missile gap in the Russians' favor. In 1959, Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, establishing a revolutionary regime just 90 miles from Florida. That was another sign that America was losing out to the Soviets. There was now a feeling that communism was overwhelming America. The grandfatherly image that Eisenhower had enjoyed was now seen as a bit of a liability. In his final address to the nation, he spoke to the American people with unprecedented candor. He warned that Americans must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. For a military man, yet alone the general who had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces, this was a stunning pronouncement. The hero of World War II, he wanted nothing more than to leave behind a presidential legacy of peace. To him, a man who had fought and seen firsthand the destruction of war, combat, it always had to be the very last resort. In accordance with the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Eisenhower was the first president to be affected by the prohibition on running for a third term. Following the end of his second term in January of 1961, his commission as a five-star general was reinstated, and he took up residence at a working farm opposite the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania. Throughout the 1960s, Eisenhower gave his influential support to a number of Republican politicians, including Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon. When Nixon won the presidency in 1968, Eisenhower commented that it was a day for rejoicing. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, of congestive heart failure. He was 78 years of age. He was eulogized by President Nixon with the following words: "Some men are considered great because they lead great armies or they lead powerful nations. For 8 years now, Dwight Eisenhower has neither commanded an army nor led a nation, and yet he remains through his final days the world's most admired and respected man, truly the first citizen of the world." So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. John F. Kennedy served as the 35th President of the United States before he was killed in 1963. While we all know about JFK, chances are that you probably know more about the conspiracy theory surrounding his assassination than the actual details of his life. This story goes far deeper than just the individual life of John F. Kennedy. In order to understand the man, you need to know the family and how he was far from the only one whose life ended in tragedy. On today's Biographics, we will discuss the real man who was behind the presidency. The Kennedys have been called American royalty, and to the outside world, they were a symbol of the American dream. It all started when Patrick Kennedy married Bridget Murphy, who emigrated from Ireland to the United States in the 1800s. Patrick died at an early age, leaving Bridget a widow and a single mother. She became a full-time maid for a wealthy family in Boston. After a few years, though, Bridget Kennedy managed to save her money and opened up a general store. Her only son, Patrick Jr., was called PJ, and at 14 years old, he started working in the general store with his mother. When he was in his 20s, PJ opened an Irish pub. He made so much money that he purchased a bar in an upscale hotel, as well as a local bank. PJ's son, Joseph P. Kennedy, would be the first to grow up enjoying the fruits of his ancestors' labor. He went to Harvard University, where he got a taste for high society. Unfortunately, though, Joseph was snubbed by a lot of his classmates and denied from entering several fraternities. While it's hard to imagine now, there was actually a huge stigma against Irish Catholics back then, especially among the American elite. Most of the upper-class American families were descended from British Protestants who taught their children that the Irish were low-class, good-for-nothing drunks. This stereotype, it motivated Joseph Kennedy to become a millionaire and prove everybody wrong. Joseph Kennedy married the mayor of Boston's daughter, Rose Fitzgerald. They went on to have 9 children together. The oldest son was named Joseph Jr., and even as an infant, his parents would say that he would grow up to be the President of the United States. His second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was born on May 29, 1917, but everyone called him Jack. Rose would go on to have 7 more children, and they all grew up watching their father work hard to make his first million before the age of 35. In the 1920s, Joseph Kennedy was hustling to make as much money as he could by any means necessary. He took advantage of prohibition by buying up the alcohol just before the laws were scheduled to change. He ran speakeasies with a man named Sam Giancana, who was connected to the Chicago mob. He also played the stock market and made millions running schemes that would now be considered rather illegal. Before long, Joseph Kennedy became the richest Irish Catholic in the United States. Since he was always trying to climb the ladder for more money and more power, Joseph Kennedy began to get involved in politics. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was impressed by Kennedy's wit and charisma, and so he was appointed as the ambassador to Great Britain. Considering that he had spent his entire life trying to prove that Irish men could be just as successful as the English, this was the cherry on top of Kennedy's achievements. And the only way it could get any better was if one of his sons became the president. Jack Kennedy was an adorable baby with big blue eyes, but even during his earliest days in life, he was already very sick. By the age of 3, he had had whooping cough, chickenpox, the measles, and scarlet fever. Jack was also diagnosed with a condition called Addison's disease. Indeed, because of all of this, he spent a lot of his young life living in the hospital. His parents, they were told by doctors that he may not survive to adulthood. However, Jack was a very happy kid, and he had a lot of love for life. Friends and relatives say that he never complained about his illnesses and that he was always smiling and always making jokes. His siblings made light of his condition, joking that if a mosquito bit him, he would die instantly. The Kennedy children, they grew up meeting members of the British aristocracy from a young age, so they were taught traditional etiquette. They became this uniquely all-American family who had the charm of British royalty. While most of the children were living with their father in London, both Jack and his older brother Joe Jr. attended a private high school called Choate Rosemary Hall in Connecticut. Joe Jr. was the most popular guy in school and the all-around golden boy. He was a varsity football player who was good-looking, outgoing, charismatic, and got straight A's. Jack, on the other hand, was the polar opposite of his older brother. Because of his disease, he grew up feeling as if every day might be his last, so he was constantly living life to the fullest. He got C's in every subject except English and history. Just like his father, Jack got some backlash from his peers for being Irish. Some of the other kids called him Marker because that was the nickname given to Irish men who would clean up the horse manure in the stables of English nobles. Instead of sulking, Jack countered the bullies by embracing the name and even proudly wore a necklace with a gold shovel charm. He created a group on campus called the Marcus Club, and they dedicated their free time to playing crazy pranks around campus. Soon enough, being a marker wasn't a derogatory term anymore. It was a badge of honor. Some of the most popular boys in the school joined his club so that they could raise hell. If YouTube had existed back then, there is no doubt that they would be filming these pranks and putting them on the platform. In fact, Kennedy was planning a prank where they'd bring in a huge amount of manure into the middle of the school's dance floor and take photographs of the students and teachers' reactions when they opened the doors. When the dean caught wind of this plan, he called in Joseph Kennedy for a parent-teacher conference. Jack was nearly kicked out of school, but his father stepped in and prevented him from being expelled. With a wink and a smile, Joseph Sr. was teaching Jack that he didn't have to play by the rules that normal people played by. The Kennedys, they were always able to pay someone off. Unfortunately, Jack's recklessness, it would catch up to him when he became seriously injured during a football game. He ruptured a disc in his back, and it took months of surgeries and time in the hospital before he could even walk again. He never fully recovered, and to be in pain for the rest of his life. After graduating from high school, Jack went to Harvard. Outside of class, he joined the swimming and sailing teams and was known for being a ladies' man. Even though he had a passion for English literature, his father pushed him to study political science and law. He also arranged for him and his older brother Joe Jr. to get summer jobs in the American Embassy in London. Jack and his father, they would send letters back and forth about politics, and when World War II began, he already had plenty of insider knowledge about what was going on in Europe. For his senior thesis, Jack wrote a book called Why England Slept, which basically reiterated his father's beliefs about how he believed Great Britain was not prepared for World War II. It became a bestseller, and it established the name John F. Kennedy as a political expert at an early age. While Jack was finishing up his degree at Harvard, his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was dealing with the very real possibility that the United States would join in World War II. Even though he was living in London at the time, Joseph Kennedy made it very clear that he was an isolationist, which meant that he did not want America to join the war. And in 1940, he made a comment to the press that he believed that he could negotiate a peace treaty with Adolf Hitler. Because of this statement, people assumed that he was a Nazi sympathizer and he was forced to step down as the ambassador. Jack and his older brother, Joe Jr., both wanted to join the Navy after the United States officially entered World War II in 1941. When Jack went through the medical examination, he was rejected because of his past back injury. His father, however, paid off the army officials and they let him pass through. Joe Jr. went on to become a pilot in Europe, while Jack worked as the commander of a torpedo ship in the South Pacific called PT-109. His back was in near constant pain, but he always suffered in silence. Swimming and sailing every summer, it paid off for Jack in a huge way because during the war, PT-109 was attacked by the Japanese and it began to sink. He spent 3 hours swimming around the wreckage, making sure that he had accounted for all of the survivors. One of the men, Patrick McMahon, was badly burned all over his body and he could hardly move. Kennedy was the strongest swimmer of the group, so he had to tow Patrick McMahon by pulling a string from his life jacket with his teeth. He led his men as they swam 3 miles to a nearby island to safety, and they were rescued a week later. When Jack returned home, he weighed only 120 pounds and he was in excruciating pain. He had to wear a back brace and walk with a cane for several months. He was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his service. The entire family celebrated his bravery by throwing him a party. Jack's older brother, Joe Jr., came home for the party, but he felt a deep sense of shame because he never did anything to prove that he was a war hero. In an attempt to be like his younger brother, Joe accepted an extremely dangerous mission to carry sensitive explosives in a plane. But before he could complete the mission, the plane exploded in midair. Joseph Kennedy Jr. died at just 29 years old. Jack Kennedy never wanted to be president of the United States. He was very much a free spirit and he wasn't suited for politics. He always said that he wanted to be a writer who sailed around the world. But now that Joe Jr. was gone, his father turned to Jack to fulfill all of his hopes and dreams. Even though he didn't have very much experience in politics, his father used his money and connections to propel JFK's career. Supported by their father, his siblings pitched in by spending a lot of their time running Jack's campaign as their full-time job. Through his late 20s and early 30s, he quickly moved up the House of Representatives and then the Senate. In 1953, Jack Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier. She was a young socialite and a writer at the Washington Times-Herald. Just like Jack, she had also been groomed by her wealthy East Coast family to be the perfect First Lady. She could speak French, Italian, and Spanish fluently, which aided her later on in international diplomacy. Soon after marrying Jacqueline, JFK wrote his second book called Profiles of Courage, which won him a Pulitzer Prize. In 1960, JFK became the Democratic nominee for the presidency when he was just 43 years old. The public loved Jack Kennedy because he seemed like any other normal guy. He spoke with a Boston accent and he wasn't afraid to visit the factories and shake the hands of the average American. Even though he came from a wealthy family, people knew that the Kennedys were self-made and saw that he was very down to earth. Young voters of the 1960s, they were eager for change and he represented the ideal American. When he moved to the White House in 1961, Jack placed his younger brother Bobby as the new Attorney General, even though he was only 35 years old. The media was obsessed with the Kennedys. Jackie would appear in magazines showing off her interior design skills at the White House, and her French fashion was always front-page news. What they didn't know is that behind the scenes, she was his rock. She would help him by translating foreign books and documents all through the night, while also giving him a place to call home outside of work. He loved spending time with his two children, John Jr. and Carolyn. Friends said that the Oval Office was always filled with the kids' toys, and the first thing he did every morning was watch cartoons and eat cereal with them. Despite having such a beautiful young family, JFK was known for having not-so-secret affairs. Rumors circulated that he was dating the buxom movie star Marilyn Monroe, and phone records proved that she frequently called the White House. But for all of his secret affairs, Jackie never strayed from her loyalty. She knew about his infidelity and considered getting a divorce, but chose to stay together for the sake of Jack's political career. In later interviews, Jackie said that Jack had never stopped appreciating the fact that they were lucky enough to live in the White House. She described it as constantly feeling like a kid on Christmas because they were always gushing over the history that surrounded them. They never took a moment for granted. The Kennedys' youthful enthusiasm is often credited for pushing America through the space race, and JFK helped bring America to the moon. Jack gave the impression that he genuinely enjoyed his job as president. He was known for smiling in the middle of a question from a journalist because he had already thought of a witty comeback. He treated his press conferences almost like they were an audience for jokes that he was writing in his spare time. One day he was holding a piece of paper as if he was about to say something incredibly serious to the crowd. He then looked up and said,
"Chimpanzee who was flying in space took off at 10:08. He reports that everything is perfect and working well."
He smiled and the room burst out in laughter. Even though he was always smiling for the press, John F. Kennedy was an expert at hiding his pain. He has been credited for saving the United States from the Cuban Missile Crisis and preventing nuclear war. During the Eisenhower administration, the CIA was planning to invade Cuba to bring down the communist leader Fidel Castro. When JFK was sworn into office in January of 1961, he was briefed on the plan that was already underway. This was the famous mission known as the Bay of Pigs, and unfortunately, it was an utter failure. After this, Fidel Castro captured American soldiers and threatened the United States with nuclear bombs. After a series of negotiations, Kennedy agreed to send $53 million in baby food and medication to Cuba in exchange for the lives of the American prisoners. By 1962, the threat of nuclear war had subsided. In a collection of interviews called the Jackie Kennedy tapes, we learned that it was terrifying for the young couple to enter office and immediately have such a huge burden on their shoulders. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK was so upset about the possibility of nuclear war that he hardly slept, and one day simply bled into the next. She also said that they had a conversation about what to do in the case of an attack. Jacqueline was more than willing to die with Jack. She said that if there was not enough time to get to the bunker, she would stand beside him on the White House lawn to watch the world end. Jack Kennedy truly did care for the American people, and he loved them even if he didn't know them personally. His wife Jackie said that he would often come home sobbing whenever he heard any tragic news of Americans dying. He had first-hand experience serving in World War II, so the last thing he wanted was for the United States to get involved in the Vietnam War. The media accused him of being soft on communism, but he was firm on his decision. If he was still alive to complete a second term, there is a very real possibility that the 58,220 Americans who died in Vietnam would have never met that fate. But, as we all know, Lyndon B. Johnson declared war on Vietnam in 1964. On November the 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy and his presidential motorcade was driving through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Jack was waving to the crowd and sitting next to his wife Jackie in the back of a 1961 Lincoln Continental. The governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife were sitting in front of them. Just as they were passing the Texas School Book Depository, at least 3 shots were fired. Jack was hit in the neck, and the next was a fatal headshot. At least one of the bullets also hit Connally. John F. Kennedy, he was pronounced dead, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the role of President of the United States. The entire country, it was stunned. Everyone who was alive back then remembers exactly where they were when Jack Kennedy was killed, and the entire nation mourned their president. A man named Abraham Zapruder was in the crowd during the attack, and he filmed the parade with his 8mm camera. He was not the only one filming that day, but he captured the clearest picture of what actually happened. Once Lyndon B. Johnson became the new president, he ordered an investigation known as the Warren Commission to examine the facts of the shooting, including a frame-by-frame analysis of the Zapruder film. The head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, was one of the men on the committee, and many believe that his influence completely manipulated the results of the investigation. The Warren Commission came to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald worked alone. He was already under investigation for collaborating with the Soviet Union and for being a potential terrorist. He also worked at the Texas School Book Depository, which is where he had set up his gun. Before he could be questioned in court, Oswald was killed 2 days later by a man named Jack Ruby. The incident was broadcast on live TV. All of this seemed too convenient, and plenty of people believed that there was a much larger conspiracy at hand. Now, there are a lot of theories out there about who was behind JFK's assassination, so keep in mind that we'll never have enough time to go over all of them in this video. One of the many reasons why people find the Warren Commission so hard to believe is the fact that only 3 shell casings were found that were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald. 2 out of the 3 bullets were shattered upon impact, leaving tiny fragments behind. However, there is one bullet that supposedly traveled through both John F. Kennedy and Governor Connally's bodies, and yet somehow it remained completely intact. This idea is called the magic bullet theory, and it's honestly really hard to believe. Many people believe that there were more than just 3 shots fired and that there was a second gunman. They believe this third bullet was planted in the car afterwards by the CIA. If there was more than one shooter, there is the very real possibility that multiple people were behind plotting his death, and the CIA wants us to believe that it was just one crazy American hating terrorist. One of the only ways to prove that there were other shots fired would be if we saw the proof on video. There was supposedly a different angle filmed of the shooting by a man called Orville Nix, which is called the Grassy Knoll footage. He sold one copy to the local press for $5,000, and he gave the second copy to the FBI. In this film, there is supposedly evidence that there was a second shooter hiding behind the bushes in a grassy knoll. However, the government seized the footage, and Nix claims that when he was given it back, there were sections of the tape that had been removed. Orville Nix's granddaughter, Gail Nix Jackson, sued the US government for $10 million or getting her family's original film back, but they claim to no longer have it. In 2017, the CIA declassified thousands of records about the JFK assassination that had never been seen by the public. While it gives more insights into the case, it does little to fuel the fire of any particular conspiracy theory. We may never know the whole story of what happened during JFK's assassination, and if there truly was a cover-up, we have no control over what's been done in the past. If he could see what happened to his legacy, surely Jack would want us to remember that he lived every day like it was his last, and when asked if he had any regrets, he only said, "I wish I had more good times." We'll leave you today with the words of Jacqueline Kennedy. Jack was young and loved. You know everything. Jack was the most unself-conscious person I had ever seen. He could naturally be attractive in a crowd, in a room. It was like having so many things in common with the many sides of you. Everyone found a part of themselves in Jack. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got There has been spirited debate among historians over which of the 46 presidents of the United States ranks as the best. There has also been spirited, though somewhat more subdued, debate over which of them was the worst. And boy, have there been some bad ones. From James Buchanan, who essentially sat on his hands and watched as the nation tore itself apart and triggered the Civil War, to Warren G. Harding, who famously presided over one of the most corrupt administrations in history. But no debate about worst presidents of all time would be complete without mentioning John Tyler. the 10th president. Tyler was never supposed to be president. He assumed the office following the sudden death of his predecessor, the first time that had happened in American history. It was just the first of a string of unprecedented events that would shape American politics for a generation. Among other things, Tyler successfully derailed the legislative agenda of his own party, causing them to expel him from their ranks. His obstinance irritated almost everyone in Washington to the point that he had few friends and entirely too many enemies. Even his most important achievement during his presidency, adding Texas to the Union, ultimately triggered a war that caused the deaths of tens of thousands and set the stage for an even more destructive war a decade later. And if that weren't bad enough, John Tyler managed to ruin his reputation even further at the end of his life when he advocated for succession and was elected to the Confederate Congress, causing many to view him as a traitor. When he died, he was accorded almost none of the honors usually given to a former president, and the historical outlook on his life and career has hardly been rehabilitated by the passage of time. John Tyler was born on March 29, 1790, in the Tidewater region of southeastern Virginia. The Tylers were one of the wealthiest families in the state, tracing their roots back to the colonial times, and had a long history of public service. Tyler's father, John Sr., known as Judge Tyler, was no exception, enjoying a distinguished political career that included a close friendship with Thomas Jefferson and election as governor of Virginia in 1808. From the start, John Tyler was raised to become everything his father was: a lawyer, a future politician, and above all, a perfect Southern gentleman concerned with his standing in society and his honor at all times. Like many boys, John loved his father and wanted to make him proud, so he studied hard, graduating from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in 1807 when he was 17. He passed the bar and became a lawyer at 19, technically 2 years too young to sit the exam, but it seems the examiner simply hadn't bothered to find out how old he was. He began practicing as a lawyer in Richmond, and he was good at it, but his real passion was politics. In fact, the only reason he became a lawyer in the first place was because it was seen as a necessary prerequisite to becoming a politician. Politics would become the defining love of Tyler's life, one that he was far more passionate about than his wife Letitia, who he married in 1813. That was more about fulfilling the Southern gentleman's obligation to marry well and produce children than any sense of romance. And produce they did, 8 of them between 1815 and 1830. Tyler's first taste of politics came in 1811 when he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, serving there for 5 years. In 1816, he seized an opportunity to get himself elected to the United States House of Representatives and would thereafter spend half the year in Washington, D.C., tending to the people's business, which caused an unfortunate drop in the revenues of his own business. It was difficult to maintain a thriving legal practice at home when he spent so much time away, and revenues at his plantation suffered when he wasn't there personally supervising it. Tyler would spend much of his life in debt, relying on borrowing money from friends and from the bank to keep himself afloat. In Congress, Tyler became more well known for what he opposed than what he supported. Almost from the moment of its founding, there had been an argument about which entity should have more power in the United States, the federal government or the individual states that divided up the country. Tyler came down firmly on the side of states' rights, and in this, like with most everything else, he emulated his father. Judge Tyler had tried unsuccessfully to prevent Virginia from ratifying the Constitution back in 1787, and when that failed, he became what was known as a constructionist. Constructionists believed that the federal government can't do anything that isn't explicitly permitted to them by the Constitution. Their opponents, variously known as the consolidationists or centralists, believed that the federal government can do anything that isn't specifically prohibited by the Constitution. These two arguments have dominated American politics for almost 250 years and will likely keep doing so into the future. John Tyler, as a believer in states' rights and constructionism, spent most of his time in Congress opposing bills he believed were unconstitutional. At the top of his list was central banking. Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States had been dissolved when its charter expired in 1811, but President James Madison, a vocal critic of the bank, found himself facing an economic crisis in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and realized a second bank would have to be chartered to manage the nation's money. When John Tyler and other Southern lawmakers attacked the bank as unconstitutional, it's important to keep in mind that the reason they were so opposed to it was because central banking tended to favor the commerce class, like businesses and manufacturers, most of whom were concentrated in the North. It didn't benefit the planter class that dominated the Southern economy because their wealth was concentrated in assets, primarily land and slaves, as opposed to cash. And John Tyler was absolutely one of the planter class. He maintained a number of farms and plantations throughout his life, all of which were operated using slave labor. He saw no reason why things should change, and why would he? The present system already rewarded him. As a result, most of his constitutional stands were made just as much out of self-interest as from ideological purity. However, it was for ideological purity that he became famous as a politician, not only as part of the House of Representatives, but also through 2 more stints in the Virginia House of Delegates, a 2-year term as governor and as a U.S. senator from 1827 to 1836. He became known as a man of principle, someone who stuck to his state's rights beliefs no matter what. This was epitomized in 1836 when he resigned from the Senate following a dispute with President Andrew Jackson. But while he was making a name for himself in Washington, his home life suffered. His frequent absences continued to play havoc on his finances, and his children largely grew up without him, frequently communicating with their father only through letters. As for his wife, many pregnancies left her in ill health. She was frequently bedridden, especially after 1839 when she suffered a stroke. She also suffered from what 19th century doctors called hysteria, which was frequently triggered by her husband's impending departure from home for their capital. Tyler himself was often ill, plagued with stomach ailments and other diseases. Some medical historians have guessed that he suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder. Less is known about what ailed Letitia, since diseases of the mind tended to be kept private back then to avoid a scandal, but the most common guess is severe depression. In 1840, John Tyler's political career seemed to be over. After his resignation in 1836, it had broken with Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party, which had caused him to gravitate to their opponents, the Whigs. But Tyler didn't like much of the Whig platform either, which was dominated by Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay, considered one of the 19th century's most brilliant politicians, was the champion of centralization, having been an architect of the Second Bank of the United States. And when Andrew Jackson successfully killed it in 1836, Clay vowed that he would start another one. 1840 was the great chance for the Whigs to seize power and make Clay's dreams a reality. The country had been gripped by an economic depression since 1837, and many blamed Democratic President Martin Van Buren and his party's fiscal policy for it. At the party's nomination convention in Harrisburg, the Whigs eventually settled on General William Henry Harrison as their candidate for president. But who would be his running mate? Nobody seemed to want the job of being vice president, and it isn't hard to see why. It was considered a political dead end. In those days, VPs had little to do besides preside over the Senate, and they only voted in that body when there was a tie to break. And it wasn't seen as a natural stepping stone for the presidency either. Between 1800 and 1968, only one man who had previously served as vice president had been elected president in his own right. After several viable candidates turned them down, the Whigs turned to Tyler, who accepted, and the ticket was complete. The Whigs won big in the 1840 election on the backs of Tippy Canoe and Tyler Too, a popular campaign slogan that referred to General Harrison's famous victory in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Not only did they win the White House, but they swept majorities in both houses of Congress as well. Henry Clay believed he had a mandate from the American people to enact his legislative agenda, and nothing appeared to stand in his way. The fate was about to change the course of American history. On the 4th of April, 1841, only a month after being sworn in as vice president, John Tyler woke up to a knock on his door in the middle of the night. The news he received was grave. President Harrison was dead, a victim of pneumonia. He was needed in Washington immediately. This was the first time that the constitutional line of succession needed to be used, and it immediately provoked confusion. No one was sure if John Tyler assumed the office of president upon the death of William Henry Harrison, or if he remained vice president and merely assumed the duties of president until a new one could be elected. Constitutional confusion was averted when Tyler himself decided that he was now the president. He took the oath of office the next day, and for the rest of his life he would return all mail that addressed him as Vice President Tyler or Acting President Tyler unopened. This set a precedence. In the 7 subsequent cases where a president died in office, the vice president has taken over after taking the oath of office. The line of succession was eventually clarified with ratification of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution in 1967. Still, it wasn't all smooth sailing for John Tyler. For the rest of his term, his opponents derided him as his accidency because of the way that it assumed the office. John Tyler's presidency was largely defined by what happened in those first few months after he assumed the office. In September of 1841, a special session of Congress was called to address the ongoing financial crisis. Twice during that session, Henry Clay and the Whigs passed bills to create a national bank that they believed was needed to right the economic ship, and twice they were stymied when President Tyler vetoed the bill. As a result, nothing was done, and the Whigs looked impotent. This enraged Clay, whose electoral landslide was now falling to pieces all around him. But in hindsight, it hardly seems surprising, since Tyler had always been opposed to a central bank. The real question is why the Whigs would have risked putting him on the ticket in the first place. Harrison was 68 years old, an old man by 19th century standards. There was always a risk of him dying in office. It seems the only answer to this is that nobody thought of it as a possibility. 8 presidents had come and gone before Harrison, all of whom completed their terms without issue. Whatever the reason for putting him on the ticket, the Whigs surely regretted doing so now, and they took their wrath out on John Tyler by ejecting him from the party in the fall of 1841, leaving him as a president without a party. The entire cabinet Tyler had inherited from Harrison resigned, except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Tyler had few friends in Washington. The Whigs now hated him, and the Democrats, though they were delighted to see their opponent's agenda shredded like this, weren't willing to accept him into their ranks either, not with Andrew Jackson still as their leader. Tyler would go up against the Whigs again in 1842, this time over the issue of tariffs. With federal income tax still decades away, import duties were one of the only ways that the federal government made money. Once again, the issue split on sectional lines. Northern states favored high tariffs as it protected their industries from European competition, while southern states hated them because it impeded their exports of cotton to the textile mills of Great Britain. Tyler, as a southerner, favored free trade, but like many idealists that find themselves in positions of executive power, he discovered that in order to actually run the country, he needed to raise tariffs, not lower them. The federal government was running out of money in 1842. There was a real risk of the United States being unable to pay its bills. Still, for months, Tyler battled Congress over how much the tariffs should be raised, whether it should be a temporary or permanent measure, and over the fate of distribution, an emergency program that gave the profits from federal land sales to the states so that they could pay off their own debts. He vetoed 2 more bills that summer before an agreement that satisfied nobody was finally worked out. His bridges with the Whigs were now well and truly burned, and Henry Clay resigned from the Senate. Everyone knew it was to prepare for his run for presidency in 1844. There was even talk of impeaching the president for the first time in history, though grounds to do so were never found. Compounding Tyler's misery during this period was the death of Letitia. Tyler's wife passed away in 1842 following a second stroke, one of 3 first ladies to die while her husband was in office. For the second time in 2 years, the White House was in mourning. The Tyler administration's only major success during this period was ratification of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Great Britain, which settled a long-running border dispute between the state of Maine and the Canadian province of New Brunswick, as well as fixing the modern border between Minnesota and Ontario. But that was basically it. Tyler, it seemed, had no real policy platform of his own to offer up. Everyone knew what he was against, but what was he actually for? Tyler himself didn't seem to know most of the time. He irritated even his closest associates with his tendency to waffle back and forth on various issues, changing his mind multiple times and confusing everyone around him. By the end of 1843, however, Tyler believed he'd figured out an issue that would cement his legacy as president, and might even boost his third-party run for re-election: the annexation of Texas. Since 1836, the Republic of Texas had operated as an independent country following its victory in the Texas Revolution over Mexico. But all along, Sam Houston and the Texan leadership had been trying to convince the American government to annex them. Both the Jackson and Van Buren administrations had ignored them, worried that doing so would spark war with Mexico. But Tyler, a firm believer in manifest destiny, saw Texas as a potentially valuable part of the Union and didn't think the Mexicans would risk a war to stop the US from taking over. He had Texas fever and set his Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, to work on making the annexation happen. He faced an uphill battle in Congress, though, with the issue of Texas lying not only on party lines, but sectional ones as well. The addition of Texas as a slave state would upset the delicate balance of power kept between slave states and free states, since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and northern states weren't keen to see the slave power gain an even more dominant position in national politics than they already had. Still, in the first 2 months of 1844, it seemed like the administration had enough support for annexation in the Senate, and a treaty was being worked out with the Texans. France. Then disaster struck. On February 28, 1844, President Tyler, members of his cabinet, and hundreds of other guests took a ceremonial cruise down the Potomac River on board the USS Princeton, a newly built US Navy corvette. The ship's captain, Robert F. Stockton, took great pleasure in test firing a 27,000-pound naval cannon nicknamed Peacemaker for his guests. The gun was fired twice without incident, but when Stockton pulled the lanyard the third time, the gun barrel exploded, showering the deck with deadly shrapnel. 6 men were killed, including 2 members of Tyler's cabinet, Secretary of State Upshaw and Secretary of the Navy Thomas Gilmer. Fortunately for Tyler, he was below decks when the accident occurred. Had he been killed, history would have looked very different. As without a vice president to replace him, the president pro tempore of the Senate, one of Henry Clay's allies, would have become president. Also killed in the explosion was David Gardiner, a prominent New York attorney and friend of President Tyler. Gardiner's daughter, Julia, had been carrying on a prolonged courtship with the president for over a year, despite the fact that Tyler was 30 years older than she was. Oddly enough, the death of her father provided the push Julia Gardiner needed to finally agree to marry Tyler after rejecting him twice, and they were wed 4 months later, the first presidential wedding in American history. The death of Secretary Upshaw, the lead negotiator on the Texas Treaty, complicated matters immensely. His replacement, John C. Calhoun, was one of the most famous pro-slavery politicians in the country, and he created a scandal when he wrote in a letter to a British minister that the reason the US was annexing Texas was to protect slavery from British interference. As a result, abolitionists, Whigs, and anyone who feared war with Mexico all came out against annexation. The Senate rejected his treaty in April. The election of 1844 turned into a referendum on annexation. With no chance of being elected himself, Tyler decided to play spoiler, forcing the Democrats to nominate a pro-annexation candidate, James K. Polk, in exchange for dropping out of the race himself. This maneuver foiled Tyler's adversary, Henry Clay, one more time, as he was defeated by Polk in the election. Instead of a treaty, Tyler ensured Texas's place in the Union by a joint resolution of Congress inviting them to join, which was signed by the president on his last day in office, March 3rd, 1845. As feared, the annexation of Texas sparked conflict. The Mexican-American War would last 2 years and claim some 40,000 lives. As part of the treaty negotiations, Mexico ceded to the U.S. not only Texas, but a huge swath of territory in the Southwest, which would become 4 new states. The addition of so much new territory also inadvertently set the North and South on a collision course with each other that would end a decade later with civil war. This mostly seemed beyond the concern of John Tyler, though. After leaving office, he retired to a new plantation in Virginia that he named Sherwood Forest. He largely withdrew from politics, preferring the life of a gentleman farmer overseeing some 70 slaves as they grew wheat and corn for him. His life with his second wife was certainly much happier than with his first. Everyone who met the Tylers indicated how much John and Julia loved each other, despite their dramatic age difference. They also had a bunch more children, 7 in all, for a total of 15 between 2 wives, the most of any president. The last of his children, Pearl, was born in 1860 when John was 70 years old. This unusual circumstance, combined with a similar proclivity on the part of one of his younger children, Leon, is the reason why John Tyler is the oldest former president to still have a living grandchild, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, age 94. Tyler probably should have stayed out of the secession crisis that swept through the South in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. It wasn't like he could help himself, though, his addiction to politics rearing its head even in old age. It probably shouldn't be surprising that Tyler was the only one out of the 5 living former presidents that took the side of the Confederacy when Civil War broke out, considering that he was the only one of 5 that was from the South and also a slaveholder. But he went beyond just supporting the South. He actively called for Virginia's secession and was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. Doing this and in the moniker traitor president in the North, ruining forever what was already a bad reputation. Before he could take his seat in the rebel Congress, however, Tyler became ill. His persistent ill health had finally caught up to him, and he died on January 18th, 1862. His death was only acknowledged in the southern states. Lincoln's administration gave Tyler none of the honors that would have been expected for a former president. The northern press basically ignored his death or reported on it perfunctorily without tribute or emotion. He was buried in Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery. Today, John Tyler has been largely forgotten by the American public, just another 19th century president's name to memorize in elementary school and then forget about. For a man who was obsessed with his presidential legacy, who spent nearly his entire post-presidential life defending what he'd done from 1841 to 1845, to be relegated to American ignominy would probably be the ultimate insult. Even the South in the years after the Civil War tried to forget about Tyler, since a slave-holding former president undercut their adherence to the lost cause rhetoric that was embraced by Southern historians at the end of the 19th century. Some people would argue that that's just what he deserves, that a man who couldn't see past his own personal principles for the good of the country and defended the South and the practice of slavery even to the point of war shouldn't be remembered fondly. In life, John Tyler was a president without a party. Today, he's arguably something worse, a president without a legacy, or at least not a good legacy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the longest-serving president in U.S. history, serving 12 years in office from 1933 to 1945. He steered the nation through its worst economic crisis, only to be faced with the most horrific war in history. Though facing titanic physical challenges of his own, he imbued America with the indomitable fortitude and sense of morale that was required to spur the nation on to victory. In today's Biographics, we examine the inspirational life of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, the only child of James and Sarah Ann Delano Roosevelt in Hyde Park, New York. James recorded the events in his diary that day, writing, "At 8:45, my Sally had a splendid large boy, but was unconscious when he was born. Baby weighs 10 pounds without clothes." It was not an easy birth. In fact, both mother and baby nearly died due to the administration of too much chloroform by the doctor. Ah, good old medicine back in the day. Despite being born not breathing, Franklin went on to become a healthy child. He was raised in a privileged family, living in an impressive estate that had been in the Roosevelt family for more than a century. The Roosevelts were of Dutch extraction, having emigrated in 1654. They became an American success story due largely to development in the coal and transportation industries. Franklin's father, a Harvard Law School graduate, served as the vice president of the Delaware and Hudson Railway and also served as president for the Southern Railway Security Company. His income and his inheritance allowed him to retire to focus on his health, which had never been very good. Sarah Delano was the second wife of James. Her existence revolved around caring for her son. As a result, the majority of Franklin's early childhood was spent in the company of his mother. Sarah was an overly protective parent. She came to feel resentful of anyone who got too close to Franklin. Meanwhile, James was often the absent father. Young Franklin, though, he did benefit from the privileges of wealth and position. When he was 5 years old, he visited the White House with his father. President Grover Cleveland spoke to him personally, saying, "I have just one wish for you, young man, that you will never be president of the United States." Franklin didn't attend school. Instead, his father employed a private tutor for him. He was an able student who applied himself to his lessons. Each summer, Franklin and Sarah would vacation at the Delano homestead in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. There would also be an annual trip to Europe. During these days, Franklin learned to speak German and French. As he grew older, Franklin became an avid sportsman. He played lawn tennis and polo and rode horses and learned to shoot a rifle. In his teens, he also took to golf and sailing. It was customary for children of privilege to attend boarding school at the age of 12. But Sarah considered that her glorious boy was not yet ready to take such a big step and delayed the move for 2 years. At 14, she enrolled him at the Groton Episcopal School at Groton, Massachusetts. This school was attended by the children of the most privileged people. Although it was a shock to Franklin to suddenly be away from the protective care of his mother, he soon adjusted to dormitory life. He played a number of sports and became a member of the school debating team as well as the choir. He graduated from the school in June of 1900 with grades sufficiently impressive to secure a spot at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A Harvard man, Franklin became very socially active during his first year. He joined a number of clubs on campus and began writing for the Harvard College newspaper. He excelled in the college environment, becoming a confident and a popular student. Towards the end of 1900, Franklin's father, James, he died. A year later, another death profoundly affected him. President William McKinley was killed by an assassin's bullet, an act which propelled Franklin's distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, to the White House. This change of events served to pique Franklin's interest in his family history. He wrote a college paper titled The Roosevelts of New Amsterdam and studied the notations in the Old Dutch Family Bible. After 3 years at Harvard, Roosevelt was ready to graduate, yet he chose to stay on for another year in order to work as the chief editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper. One day in the summer of 1902, he was heading back to the family mansion at Hyde Park from New York when he happened upon an 18-year-old Eleanor Roosevelt. And yes, she did share his name. She was, in fact, a distant relative of his. The two, they hit it off immediately, and from that chance encounter, a romance blossomed. Franklin, he was captivated by Eleanor's intellectual depth and her social conscience. Things, they got serious in 1903, with Franklin, who was now studying law at Columbia University, asking for Eleanor's hand in marriage. She eagerly agreed and wanted the wedding to take place as soon as possible. Franklin's mother, Sarah, was not happy with her son's choice of bride. Whether she had something specifically against the independently minded Eleanor, or she felt threatened by any woman getting between her and her beloved boy, well, that's unclear. She convinced Franklin to at least delay the wedding, which took place on March the 17th of 1905. Eleanor, who was an orphan, was given away by her uncle, and that would be President Theodore Roosevelt. The young couple honeymooned in Europe. Upon return to New York, Franklin returned to his law studies at Columbia University. In May of 1906, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, who they named Anna Eleanor. The following year, Franklin passed the New York State bar exam. He secured his first job as a law clerk at a prominent New York law firm. A second child, James, came along in December of 1907. During 1907, Franklin's mother, Sarah, had been financing the building of a double house on 65th Street in New York. It was to be a present to the couple, with her living in one house and them living in the other. The living spaces, they were separated by a single door. While grateful, Eleanor was frustrated at the way that Sarah was smothering their marriage, making decisions that should have been Eleanor's domain. This was a difficult time in Eleanor's life. Children were coming along regularly, yet she admitted that she was not a natural mother. She went so far as to write that she did not even like her children. She hired a nanny and spent more time on local New York social issues, such as working for improved factory conditions for workers. Franklin's first foray into politics, it came in 1910 when he became a delegate to the New York Democratic State Committee. He was then asked if he wanted to run for the office of state assemblyman. It was assumed that the sitting assemblyman was about to retire. Franklin, he was enthused, but then he found out that the incumbent was not planning to retire at all. There was, though, an opening to run for New York State Senator. With no experience, but plenty of enthusiasm, he began a grassroots campaign that soon endeared him to the working people of the city. He faced an uphill battle, with the state being decidedly Republican. However, on election day, he found himself ahead by 1,000 votes, and he was suddenly the New York State Senator. The Roosevelts now rented out their house in New York City and moved to the state capital in Albany, New York. Franklin, though, he soon became embroiled in political intrigue. A powerful faction of the New York Democratic Party, known as Tammany Hall, had run the party for decades. Roosevelt, however, was not one to do what he was told. He was not going to be anybody's puppet. He stated his opposition to the Tammany Hall group and built his own support network, who were known in the papers as the Little Group of Insurgents. Through his adherence to principle and his refusal to back down, Roosevelt developed a reputation as a man who would stand up for his beliefs. As his first term drew to a close, though, Roosevelt was struck down by typhoid fever, which has a 20% death rate. He recovered, though, and vigorously campaigned for a second term as New York State Senator. He won this one by 1,700 votes. Roosevelt was a supporter of Woodrow Wilson, who won the presidency in 1912. Wilson set about rewarding those who had stood by him. In due course, Roosevelt was offered the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was the same position that his distant cousin Theodore had held in 1897. Franklin now gave up his state Senate seat to take on the new role. Roosevelt's job had him traveling the country to inspect ships and naval yards. He soon discovered that the Navy was really quite ill prepared for war, and he campaigned for the creation of a naval reserve of 50,000 men, along with increased spending on shipbuilding. Roosevelt didn't seem to care that his words or actions were not politically expedient. His only interest, it seemed to be, in bolstering the Navy. This attitude has earned him respect across the political spectrum. With the outbreak of war in Europe in August of 1914, Roosevelt became even more dedicated to his work of building up the U.S. Navy. He excelled in the role and won many advantages for the Navy. With the 1916 presidential election, Roosevelt's future, it hung in the balance. If Wilson was returned to office, he would no doubt retain his position as Assistant Navy Secretary, but if a Republican moved into the White House, he would more than likely be unceremoniously dumped. It was an extremely closely fought race, with Roosevelt later describing it as the most extraordinary day of my life. At the end of the day, Wilson won out to retain the presidency, and Roosevelt's job was secure. With America's entry into the war in 1917, his position took on more urgency. He was instrumental in the drive to elicit public donations for the war effort, as well as the development of mine detonation technology. The pressures of his work kept Roosevelt away from his family for increasingly long pressures of time. He began an affair with the social secretary of his wife, Eleanor, that would continue on and off until his death. The woman's name was Lucy Mercer. Sometime in around 1918, Eleanor found the letters between the two. They revealed that Franklin was planning to divorce her and make a new life with Lucy. However, Franklin's mother refused to permit such a scandal, warning her son that it would ruin his political career. From that point on, Roosevelt's marriage was one of expedience and convenience. Eleanor soon set up a separate home in Hyde Park for her and the children, and she threw herself into her social work. The break in their marriage was so severe that when Roosevelt asked Eleanor in 1942 to come back and live with him due to his poor health, she refused. In September of 1918, Roosevelt made a state visit to France and Britain to inspect naval facilities. On the return trip on board the USS Leviathan, the influenza pandemic, it ran through the ship. A number of people died and Roosevelt became very ill. However, he recovered before he reached New York. Following the end of hostilities in 1918, Roosevelt began looking towards his next run for office. After much consultation, he decided to campaign for the Democratic vice presidential nomination. His bid was successful, and he found himself on the ticket alongside Ohio Governor James Cox, who was running for president. Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary to the Navy and spent the next year and a half on the campaign trail. The 1920 election, it ended up being a resounding victory for the Republicans, with Warren G. Harding securing the presidency. Roosevelt accepted the loss with grace. He returned to New York to pick up his law practice. In August of 1921, the family were vacationing at Campobello Island when he was struck down with an illness. It was believed that he had contracted poliomyelitis, with the condition paralyzing him from the waist down. More recent analysis suggests that it may in fact have been an autoimmune disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Sarah urged her son to retire and live out his life in retirement. But his closest advisors, including wife Eleanor, they felt otherwise. He should continue with his public career, which they assured him was on a trajectory towards the White House. Thus encouraged, he spent the next few years in physical rehabilitation. If he couldn't walk unaided, he would at least project that impression to the public. He taught himself to walk a few paces with metal braces on his hips and with the aid of a cane. He was determined that the public would not see him in a wheelchair. In 1926, Roosevelt financed the building of a hydrotherapy debilitation clinic in Warm Springs, Georgia. He spent much of his time there throughout the remainder of the 1920s. During his rehab years, Roosevelt maintained close contact with the Democratic Party. Then in 1928, he reluctantly ran for governor of New York. He won by a margin of just 1%. His governorship was marked by a focus on innovative infrastructure projects such as hydrostatic power plants and the institution of his fireside chats, during which he spoke directly over the radio to the people of New York. Winning re-election in 1930, Roosevelt introduced an economic relief package to help the millions suffering from the side effects of the Depression. He also established a number of commissions to root out public corruption. As the popular two-term governor of the country's most dynamic state, Roosevelt was a front-runner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. He won the nomination at the Democratic National Convention. In his acceptance speech, he promised, "I pledge you, I pledge myself, to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. This is a call to arms." Roosevelt ran on a platform of government-funded public works, farm relief, and the repeal of prohibition. On the strength of these policies and his winning personality, he won 57% of the popular vote to become the 32nd President of the United States. After taking the oath of office, Roosevelt delivered his inaugural address, best known for its famous line,
"So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
After the inaugural address, a woman by the name of Sarah Love said, "Any man who can talk like that in times like these is worthy of every ounce of support a true American has." Roosevelt assumed office in the midst of the greatest financial crisis that the United States has ever faced. Unemployment, it was at 25%. Banks had closed all over the country, and more than 2 million people were homeless. Roosevelt dedicated himself to saving the nation. He would do so by putting in place the relief programs of his first New Deal. He restructured systems that were broken, and this invigorated the spirit of his people. Another key to this invigoration were his fireside chats, which were something he continued from his governorship. He spoke to the American people as a loving father, full of optimism and of good ideas. During his first term, Roosevelt established a number of major relief initiatives. These included the Federal Relief Administration and the Public Works Administration, which provided employment to 250,000 men throughout the country. In August 1935, he also signed the Social Security Act, which included benefits for the unemployed and the elderly. From 1935, Roosevelt embarked on his second New Deal, squarely focused on the business community. Wholesale changes were made to the banking industry and business in order to make things fairer to the everyday man. By 1936, Roosevelt's policies and personality had made him one of the most popular presidents in all of history. The election that year, it was a landslide victory, with the president taking every state except Maine and Vermont. During his second term, Roosevelt spent a lot of time embroiled in legal challenges to many of the programs that he had brought in during his first term. In 1936, the Supreme Court was largely conservative. However, by 1941, Roosevelt had appointed 7 of the 9 justices. With growing tension between Germany and the other European nations, Roosevelt pursued a policy of U.S. isolationism. However, by mid-1938, with public opinion in the U.S. firmly against German aggression towards the Jews, he began building up the military for the possibility of war. When the war broke out in September of 1939, he actively looked for opportunities to support Britain and France. Roosevelt struck up a great friendship with Winston Churchill, who became British Prime Minister in May of 1940. The United States, it began supplying an increasing number of armaments to the British, while at the same time continuing to build up its own war footing. The fall of France, after just 6 weeks, it was a shock to everyone in America. From that point forward, the majority of people, they were inclined towards American intervention in the European war. In 1940, Roosevelt made the decision to run for an unprecedented third term as president. There had been a tradition of limiting presidents to 2 terms. However, Roosevelt was convinced that a change of leadership in a time of approaching war would be disastrous for the country. Throwing himself into the campaign, he won another overwhelming victory, winning 85% of the popular vote and 38 of 48 states. Throughout 1941, Roosevelt became overtly critical of Hitler. He became furious when Hitler began threatening American shipping in the Atlantic, declaring, "We will not let Hitler prescribe the waters of the world on which our ships may travel. The American flag is not going to be driven from the seas either by his submarines, his airplanes, or his threats." Then, on December 7th, 1941, more than 350 Japanese fighter planes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Some 3,000 people lost their lives. Dozens of ships were sunk, and many planes were destroyed as they just sat on the runway. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress with these memorable words. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He then asked Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan, which it duly did. Within days, the declaration of war was extended to include Germany and Italy. Franklin Roosevelt, he was now a wartime president. As the U.S. war machine rolled into action with hundreds of thousands of men being sent to Europe and the Pacific theaters of war, Roosevelt focused on building up morale on the home front. His main vehicle for achieving this was still his fireside chats. On February the 23rd, 1942, he told the nation,
"Here are 3 high purposes for every American. 1, we shall not stop work for a single day. If any dispute arises, we shall keep on working while the dispute is solved by mediation or conciliation or arbitration until the war is won. 2, we shall not demand special gains or special privileges or special advantages for any one group or occupation. 3, we shall give up conveniences and modify the routine of our lives if our country asks us to do so. We will do it cheerfully, remembering that the common enemy seeks to destroy every home and every freedom in every part of our land.
With the Americans having just entered the war, the Russians won a decisive victory in the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazis, they were finally being pushed back towards Berlin from the east. Roosevelt and his generals, they were convinced that a similar push from the west would drive the Nazis into submission. The planning for a grand invasion of Western Europe had begun. Throughout 1942 and 43, Roosevelt had a number of other meetings with Allied leaders, including Churchill, Stalin, and the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. On June 5, 1944, President Roosevelt addressed the American people with the following news. Yesterday, on June 4, 1944, Rome fell to American and Allied troops. The first of the Axis capitals is now in our hands. 1 up and 2 to go. The following day, a major step was taken in taking out the biggest Axis power. On the morning of June 6, 1944, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. After fierce fighting, the German army it was pushed back. Now the Nazis, they were being squeezed from both sides. It was now clear to Roosevelt that an Allied victory was coming. He began to place his focus on the logistics of that victory. He spoke of the Allies as a group of united nations. He was convinced that only a worldwide union of nations could prevent a future war. Roosevelt's championing of what was to become the United Nations finally brought Woodrow Wilson's dream to life. Wilson's dream had been the imperfect League of Nations. But as we all know, the United Nations is still around today. With the 1944 presidential election rapidly approaching, Roosevelt said he felt torn, stating, "All that is within me cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River, to avoid public responsibilities, and to avoid also the publicity which in our democracy follows every step of the nation's chief executive. Such would be my choice." But we of this generation chance to live in a day and an hour when our nation has been attacked, and when its future existence and the future existence of our chosen method of government are at stake. Roosevelt ran for a 4th term, but he did not involve himself in the campaign. Still, he won again. He was now set to serve out 16 years as the President of the United States, but it wasn't to be. The stresses of the war had taken a heavy toll on Roosevelt. He was now 62 years old. He looked weary, suffered from high blood pressure and a weak heart. During the summer of 1944, he came down with a bad cold. He was still sick when he traveled by ship in February 1945 to Malta for the Big Three conference with Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt was exhausted when he arrived back in Washington on February the 28th. People commented that he looked like he was dying, and they weren't far wrong. All Roosevelt wanted to do now was sleep. At the beginning of April, he managed to escape Washington for his retreat at Warm Springs, Georgia. On the morning of April the 12th, he sat while an artist painted his portrait. They stopped for lunch at 1 p.m. 15 minutes later, he complained that he had a terrible headache. Then he slumped to the ground. He was experiencing a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He died at 3:35 p.m. on the 12th day of April, 1945. It was just 27 days before the war in Europe came to an end. Having guided his country through its worst depression and its most harrowing war, FDR was finally at peace. Historians, they consistently rank Roosevelt, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln as the 3 greatest presidents. FDR biographer Gene Edward Smith wrote of Roosevelt, "He lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees." So I really hope you found that video inspiring. I think it's the right word for that. I rather enjoyed that one. If you did like it, please do give us a thumbs up below. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos from us, and hit that bell so you actually find out when we put out new videos. We do a few a week, so do that. You'll find out about them. And as always, thank you for watching.